Hello, and welcome to the Logistics Management Podcast Series. My name is Jeff Berman. I'm Group News Editor for Logistics Management Magazine, as well as the Peerless Media Supply Chain Group. Today, we welcome Jim Tompkins to our podcast. Jim is chairman of Tompkins Ventures down in Raleigh, North Carolina. Jim is an international authority on designing and implementing end-to-end supply chains. He has started 15 businesses that have done more than $2 billion in worldwide revenue over the course of his 50-year career. Jim has worked with private equity. He's designed countless industrial facilities and also supply chain solutions, and enhanced the profitable growth of numerous companies, giving him an insider's view into what makes great companies even better. In 2020, Jim founded Tompkins Ventures, LLC, a global hands-on solutions network that helps companies address the five major factors for business success. Those being leadership, capital, technology, supply chain slash facilities, and procurement. He previously spent more than 40 years as founder and chairman of Tompkins International, from a backyard startup into an international consulting and implementation firm. Jim received his Bachelor's of Science in Industrial Engineering in 1969, his Master's of Science in Industrial Engineering in 1970, and his PhD in 1972, all from Purdue University. So go Boilermakers. Hey, Jim, welcome to our podcast.
Great to be here, Jeff, and thank you for having me. And yes, I'm glad football season's over for the Boilermakers.
Hey, well, I'm a Syracuse fan, and we have a good team about every 5 years, which was this year, so I'll take it. Um,
Okay,
so, Jim, before we get into sort of the nitty gritty, um, why don't you just, for our audience, if you don't mind, just please help explain exactly what it is you guys do at Tompkins Ventures, who your customers are, types of customers that is, and the services that you guys provide.
sure, Jeff. And I appreciate that question because it's quite complex. After running Tompkins International for 40 years, founding it and running it for 40 years, people associate me with being a consultant. And
Right.
it's kind of interesting because Tompkins Ventures is not really a consultant that does work. What Tompkins Ventures is, it's a matchmaking organization that is a community, it's an ecosystem. And what we do is we address major supply chain and business challenges. So we don't deal with small problems or trivial, save me 6% of procurement or reduce my transportation spend by 5%. We get involved with major transformational activities. Um, so let me explain how we kind of got here, and then that allows you to understand what we do better.
Sure.
Um, I I see things that go through a growth phase, then through a transformation phase, and then a reinvention phase. And in my 50 years story, there's an awful lot of growth. There's several transformation. And then in 2020 with COVID was the first real major reinvention that I've been through. And what we see is that growth is driven by increased demand. And so that's constantly, if you're doing the business right, you're constantly going to be growing because of
Hmm.
increasing demand. And transformation takes place at various inflection points. And so we saw when WMS came out, that was an inflection point. When WES came out, when AI came out, what we saw is technology drove transformation in our business. But reinvention didn't really occur in the consulting industry because business was kind of the same. I mean, the disruptions were minimal, innovations were minimal as far as the business model. And so we didn't see that. But what we've seen since COVID, for example, a reinvention would be Uber for transportation. A
Hmm.
reinvention would be Netflix for entertainment. Amazon is certainly a reinvention for shopping. And so what we saw is the consulting industry up through 2020 had continued to grow, and there was transformations, but it wasn't until COVID that we had a reinvention. And what the reinvention happened is that the nonstop disruptions resulting in us having a new norm. There was a paradigm shift. We went from disruptions being something that happens now and then to disruptions being something that happens on a nonstop basis. And so if we look at 2019, we see there's three types of consulting firms. There's broad and shallow firms, and this is for companies that need basic business requirements. And so this is kind of the unexperienced MBA consultant that comes in and talks about business basics. There's
Hmm.
the basic firms. Then the second is the firms like Tompkins International, which are very deep but narrow firms. So Tompkins International was very deep on warehousing and inventory and transportation. But that was kind of our bandwidth. And if the company did something different with respect to their brand or their sales or their marketing, it didn't necessarily hit us because we began with inventory. And so we could make some bad assumptions there. In a similar way, on the outbound, we looked at transportation to get the product delivered as specified. But what were those specifications? It went from same week to same day, and all of a sudden the transportation was different. And so what we see is that what came out of the 2020 reinvention is that there is difficulty in using deep but narrow consulting firms. And so that leaves the third type. Number one didn't work so well. Number two doesn't work so well. Number three is deep and broad. Now, these
Okay.
are the elite firms, the big firms who really are good at everything. Unfortunately, to be good at everything, you have a very large business. You got a lot of top people. You got a lot of top salaries. And so what happens is your value proposition is called into question. And so the top firms, they do good work, but there's a question of what is their overhead cost versus what is the benefit of the work. If I was going to spend $10 million, but that was going to give me $10 million of savings for 5 years, I'm happy. But if I'm going to spend $10 million and then I'm going to get a $10 million savings and it's only going to last for 3 months, I'm not so happy. And so, as disruption affected the way companies operated, the deep and broad firms had less and less appeal. So if you look at the consulting industry, the broad and shallow is not so good. The deep but narrow is not so good. And the deep and broad is uneconomical. And so what we need is the capability of deep and broad, but with low overhead. And the
Hmm.
way to do that is by not hiring the people, but by developing an ecosystem where people are available. So when we find an opportunity, what we will do is we'll look at that opportunity and say, what is the group of people that we can put together for this specific project? We're not going to pay those people except when they're working on this project. And we're going to create an innovation team for this specific project that's going to come together, work as a team, and then when the project's over, the team's going to disperse. And so we have the deep and the broad capability, but it's with low overhead, and therefore we can produce some real value. So Tompkins Ventures has business partners who find the opportunity. We have commercial partners, we have capital partners, and we have consulting partners who actually engage on an ad hoc basis for this specific opportunity to get the job done. So what we are is we're an ecosystem where we match make groups of people to put them together to create a real innovative solution for our clients. The types of clients we work for are typically clients between, say, 200 billion, the types of firms that we're working with. So it's medium to large size firms, and we're working on significant reinvention efforts.
Okay. All right, great. That's a really, really thorough, detailed overview of what you guys are all about, Jim, and I really appreciate that. You really helped to put that in perspective. And late last year, Jim, you guys had put out, well, you had authored a white paper entitled "Reglobalization: Supply Chains in a Trump Disrupted World." Um, and I'll save the question of what is reglobalization exactly for you in a second. But I just wanted to share sort of the lead or the teaser that comes with that white paper, and it's simply Trump's return to the White House marks a significant profound shift in U.S. domestic and international policies. For businesses, this shift mandates reglobalization. So, what is reglobalization, Jim? Sort of, how do you define it? How did you get interested in this?
Well, how I got interested is in March of 2020. COVID threw all of our supply chains just for a real chaos, and we couldn't perform. In fact, been married to my wife for 56 years, and her girlfriends never knew what Jim did for a living. All of a sudden, in March and April of 2020, they were calling my wife and said, "We were listening to the news, and we heard they just mentioned supply chain. Isn't that what Jim does?" And my wife said, "Yes, yes, that's what Jim does." And so they said, "So is it Jim's fault we can't buy toilet paper?" And so, and so she said, "Yes, it's his fault." But what we saw is then in 2020, 2020, this chaos where the new norm became disruption. Prior to that, if you look back at 2019 and before, what we did is we had some pretty good certainty. We kind of knew what the demand was going to be. We kind of
Hmm.
knew what the supply was. We kind of knew what the lead times were, and we were kind of in control. But now, all of a sudden, 2022, we're out of control. And I find myself being inundated by clients that are saying, "Jim, we need East Coast capability. We've given up on just in time, and we're doing just in case because we have to. But doing just in case requires a lot more space, and we don't have the availability of affordable space, and we don't have the availability of labor. So find us some capacity on the East Coast." Well, we looked and looked and looked, and we couldn't find capacity on the East Coast. And so
Okay.
we then start saying, "Well, where else can we go?" And we said, "Aha, why don't we go to the Dominican Republic? Land is cheap, labor is cheap, it's not too far away. We can get there in 4 hours by air." And so what we can do is we can take the Dominican Republic and make it, and I wrote a paper on this called the Dominican Republic, the Singapore of the Western Hemisphere.
Hmm.
And so we started working on that in 2022. But just as we were starting to get our delivery mechanism lined out in 2023, I wrote another paper called "The World is Flat Except When It Isn't," the yin and yang of globalization and deglobalization. And what that was about is people were saying, we cannot rely on just China. We need to do China plus one. And if we're going to do China plus, where's that plus one? Is that Indonesia? Is that India? Is that Mexico? Is that Turkey? Where are we going to do the plus one? And what's the impact on that on supply chains? And so when we then got to 2024, we're trying to deal with this reglobalization thing, which is how do we deal with nearshoring? How do we deal with reshoring? And how do we deal with friendshoring? And there's a
Hmm.
shifting of supply chain away from doing the cheapest to what we want to do is we want to do the best supply chain, which includes adaptability, agility, resilience, and responsiveness. And so, what we want to do in our supply chain starting in 2024 is reglobalization, which takes us from doing the optimal to doing the optional. We don't want to have an optimal supply chain because the rate of disruption is going to throw us a monkey wrench and it's not going to work. So we need to have optionality. That's why the winning football teams are playing option football. They
Hmm.
don't take the quarterback and say, "Go around the end and run." They say, "Go around the end. But if you see they do this, then throw the pass. If you see them do this, then hike a lateral to the guy behind you." And they have options, and those options are responding to the defense. And that's what we need to do. We need to respond to the other players. And so, what we're going to see starting next Monday is 47, President Trump is going to put in place some tariffs. And these tariffs are now taking us to a point it's beyond China plus one. And now we're doing ABC,
Hmm.
anywhere but China.
Right.
And so we're not doing any single sourcing, and we're moving out of China. We're going into India and Indonesia, Malaysia and Vietnam and Thailand. We're coming to Mexico. We're coming to Brazil. we're moving to Turkey, we're moving to Poland. And so it's totally re-globalizing the supply chain. We have different raw material sourcing, we have different manufacturing sourcing, we have different points of departure, which different transportation, we have different delivery requirements, and we're now moving away from owning our own warehouses. We want to be more optional, and so we're using 3PL warehouses even more. And so
Okay.
re-globalization is how to deal with these massive shifts, which we need to do on an ongoing basis.
Okay, great. That's a terrific explanation. And to put sort of current events into perspective, Jim, as it relates to reglobalization, as everyone knows by now, the Eastern Gulf uh, Coast Port labor strike, the dock worker strike, never came to fruition due to a tentative agreement being inked last week between the International Longshoremen Association and the United States Maritime Alliance. But, my question is, what would be the impact of something like a port strike in terms of reglobalization? And now that it's been avoided, where does the strike not happening? How does that help impact slash hurt reglobalization efforts?
Well, the direct impact is the cost. I mean, the typical port worker is now going to be making $200,000 a year, uh,
Right.
and the productivity of all of the ports in the United States, East, Gulf, and West, are well below of those in Asia and in Europe. And so we've got a cost problem that's substantial, that we're going to have to deal with. We have attempted to handle the automation thing, but it hasn't been handled in a way that's going to really allow the ports to put in automation. The unions really played this one smartly because they did it at a timing when Biden really couldn't impact the Taft Hartley Act. And now this is before the inauguration.
Yeah.
So Trump didn't want to do it either because of the union vote. And so they did it very wisely. But if we had a traditional, optimal, single sourcing port strategy with a single source on means of transportation, the port strike of the 36 ports on the East Coast or on the West Coast, that would absolutely shut the nation down. It would cost us something, 4-5 billion dollars a day
Yeah.
in supply chain congestion, and even but more important than cost, our stores are going to very quickly run out of product, and so it's a major challenge. We need to use Taft Hartley. It's not a political issue; it's an economic issue. And what we're doing is we're letting a small group of people in the ILA dictate to us how the country is going to operate. That's not healthy. It's you
Right.
don't give an ant the control of your house. And so we need to be real cautious as we move forward. I want to treat the union fairly. Those gentlemen and ladies do work hard on the port, but we need to maintain some ability to be realistic about the value they bring for the job they do, or they're going to be out of work because we're going to use air or other means of getting the product in, bring it into Mexico, and bring it up by land.
Right. I mean, the deal is hopefully going to be ratified fairly soon, and that would be a 6-year deal. So hopefully that will put things to rest for a spell. Um, and just wanted I know you had just mentioned tariffs, Jim. Obviously, they've been the talk of the industry for more than a while now. And as you said, come next week, there's a very good likelihood that we're going to see uh, some action being taken on increased tariffs, new tariffs, etc. Um, yeah, shippers, supply chain stakeholders obviously have been well prepared for this. It's been telegraphed in advance for a while. What do you think key shipper strategies are, or I guess necessarily, or if not are, should be as it relates to taking on tariffs and it's still ensuring they have fluid freight flows and business operations?
Well, it's real clear that tariffs are going to increase between the United States and China.
Hmm.
President Trump has made it very clear that tariff is the most beautiful word in the dictionary. I would suggest, although President Trump hasn't said this, if you watch how he operates, he probably thinks the second best word in the dictionary is negotiation. And
Right.
so when he's using tariffs, the press oftentimes thinks that he is serious about everything he says. I do not believe he's serious about putting tariffs on Canada or Mexico. After all, he is the one that negotiated uh, the U.S., Mexican, and Canadian deal that's in place. He negotiated that deal.
That's
So
right.
it's his deal. So he's not going to throw that under the bus. Now, if he has problem with control of the border and he has problem with illegal drugs, he will pull that negotiation tool and he will use that negotiation tool. But he's not doing it that he's trying to put tariffs on Mexico or Canada. What he's trying to do is say we must maintain our borders and we got to stop this illegal drug stuff. So there's some of these tariffs like China. Some people saying, well, that's going to increase the cost of goods in the United States. No, no, no. It depends what else they do. There's economic policy and there's trade policy, and you put in a trade policy increase in tariff. Well, what if you reduce taxes for people? So okay, it is going to increase your grocery bill $100 a year, but he's also going to give you $100 credit on your taxes. And so there's ways that he can mitigate these things, and there's ways companies can mitigate the tariffs by having a reglobalization strategy.
Hmm.
As if they put the 20% tariff on China, I'm going to move that production to Vietnam. If
Yeah.
they do this, I'm going to do this. If they do this, I'm going to do this. And we got to have that scenario planning and we got to have it in place. Now, the problem is a lot of companies haven't been paying attention. And so there's a lot of companies that don't have those plans. And so where I think we need to go is we need to get to the point where we get what I call DSCO, which is dynamic supply chain optionality. So we got to realize the options have to be dynamic for our supply chain. So we have a, if you will, a playbook that says if we get these tariffs, I'm going to change these sources. I'm going to use these transportation means. I'm going to use these ports. If we get increase in port operations costs, I'm going to bring the product into the port of Manzanillo in Mexico, truck it over to Monterey, and bring it up north into the center of the country. If this, so I have a dynamic optionality that I can put in place. You tell me what the tariff is of the day, and I'm going to tell you how I'm going to respond by next Monday.
Okay. Yeah, that's well said. And just to tie it back to reglobalization, Jim, and just in terms of where is reglobalization going from here? And I just asked that because come next week, uh, as we've been discussing, things are going to change and certainly be somewhat different. So
Oh,
what does that mean for the future path of reglobalization? I'm sure we could talk about that one alone for a long time, but if you were just to, sum it up.
well, it's what we're going to do is products that can be automated. We will bring them back and reshore them in America. Products that cannot be automated, that are still going to require manual labor, in the United States, a lot of that's going to go to Mexico. Some of that's going to go to Brazil. Some of that's going to go to the Dominican Republic. In Europe, some of that stuff's going to go to Turkey. Some of it's going to go to Hungary. In Asia, some of that's going to go to Vietnam, some Taiwan, some uh, Thailand, some Malaysia, some Indonesia. And so what we're going to find is we're going to seek out the countries that are good with manual labor, and we're going to use their capability. And so we're going to be looking more and more towards Africa. Africa is not a 2025 solution, but a 2027, 2028. We're going to have more production coming out of Africa.
Okay.
Africa is really close to South America, which makes it close to the East Coast of the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. Key proximity. All right, Jim. So just in a couple of minutes we have left here, I know we've obviously been talking a lot about the reglobalization, tariffs, more global things. Let's shift gears to technology just for a few minutes. Let's just talk about the ongoing advent of artificial intelligence, or more commonly referred to as AI, within logistics. You can't help but notice. how many companies are popping up that are AI focused, and as well as legacy companies that are just simply really making significant investments into the technology. I'd like to hear from you, Jim, just in terms of where you think it's going and maybe the progress it's made to date.
Well, AI, has been around for 30 years. If we look back at the original machine learning type of AI, and it evolved into some really cool toys that in the last 3 years have become absolutely mandatory tools for creativity and innovativeness and research and data assimilation. And I think AI, uh, one of my grandsons just got suspended for school for using AI in his homework.
Oh boy.
Kind of reminds me of how ridiculous it was when I was in school. They said you couldn't use your calculators to do the test on the exam because they wanted you to learn the math. Well, guess what? We all use our calculators and our computers now. And so it didn't hurt our brains. We're still okay. So I
Yeah.
think it's important not to restrict the kids from using AI, but teach them how to use AI because it's
Yes.
a tremendous productivity enhancement. The area that I think the most exciting opportunities are going to come in going forward is conversational AI. So AI is great at answering questions, but to this point today, we've trained some AI. In fact, I've been involved with a company that's training AI to ask questions. The difficulty is when we have a conversation, just like this conversation, Jeff. I've asked questions, you've asked questions, you've answered questions, I've answered questions. We've had a conversation. And so
Yes.
it's conversational AI. When you teach AI how to really ask questions, it's really frustrating because once it knows how to ask questions, all it's going to do is ask you questions. And so, you ask me a question, I ask you a question back, you ask me a question,
Yep.
and no one learns anything. We don't go anywhere. We just ask questions. So you need not to just be able to ask questions or just be able to answer questions. You need to understand what we call conversation flow AI. And that's the next big breakthrough when it's not me asking AI for help, it's AI and I having a conversation about what I'm trying to accomplish and how it can use the wisdom of the last 200 years of everything that was published to bring it in front of me when I need it so that I can really have the best information when I'm making my decisions, I'm writing my papers, I'm making recommendations. And so when AI goes to the next level, it's really going to be cool. I see that coming in 2026. And so plenty of more uh, traditional AI is going to be keeping happening. But by 2026, this thing is going to explode to a whole new level.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. Well, listen, Jim, this brings us to the end of our time for today's podcast. So, on behalf of Logistics Management Magazine and also the Peerless Media Supply Chain Group, I'd like to say, like to offer up a big thanks for spending some time with us today.
My pleasure, Jeff. Thanks so much.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those in the audience, please feel free to go ahead and check out the Tompkins Ventures website, Tompkins Ventures.com. And Jim is also on LinkedIn, where you can check out that reglobalization white paper we were talking about, titled Reglobalization Supply Chains in a Trump Disrupted World. And Jim is can be found on LinkedIn, linkedin.com/IN/Jim Tompkins one, and followed by another backslash. And also, please feel free to check Logistics Management out on Twitter. We are at Logistics MGMT. And also, please go ahead and sign up for our podcast if you're not already doing so. All you need to do is go punch up Supply Chain 24/7 wherever you get your podcast, and it should come right up. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day, and we'll catch up with you next time.